Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the Literary Translation Centre at Day 3 of the London Book Fair 2019. My name is Daniel Hahn, and I'm delighted to have been asked to chair this morning's panel on women in literature and translation, realities and stereotypes. Only one person cheered for that. That's very disappointing. Women in literature and translation, realities and stereotypes. There we go. Now, I'm thinking, are they cheering the realities or the stereotypes? I don't know which. Huge fans of stereotyping women in the audience. Excellent. We're going to have a fairly broad-ranging conversation about being a woman in different parts of publishing, in different parts of writing, to what extent it affects that experience. And we will, of course, leave plenty of time for you to be part of the conversation in the latter part of the hour. So we're going to talk for a little bit and leave time for you towards the end. I'm just very briefly going to introduce the people I have on stage with me, who are a fascinating and accomplished group of 4 women who work in very different parts of the publishing chain, if you like. And I'm going to introduce you I'm trying to think, I should kind of introduce you in sort of publishing order somehow. So I'm going to start with Güzel, who, wave your hand so people know which one is you. Because Güzel is here as the writer and therefore representing all of the writers in the world. It's a slightly difficult panel because we're trying to do quite a lot. So you are here for the writers. Güzel is in fact a filmmaker as well. She did a PhD in Moscow Filmmaking School. And her debut novel, Zuleika, which was published in 2015, sold over 170,000 copies in Russia. It's been translated into more than 30 languages, including one language by Lisa, who was here as the oh, there we are. Can we wave this?
Yeah,
I feel we should do some selling since we're here.
Yeah.
Did you have a little suitcase with you? You can go round the back and sell
back
copies.
At the Read Russia stand, yeah.
Lisa, who is this person here, is a very brilliant and award-winning literary translator as well as a blogger. She won the 2016 Read Russia Prize for Contemporary Russian Literature. She's been shortlisted, I think, twice for the Oxford Weidenfeld Translation Prize. Her translations, as we said, include Güzel's book, Zuleika, and she has a blog which focuses on contemporary Russian fiction, and we might talk about that as well. I think it'd be interesting to think about your role as I think translators can be sort of opinion shapers as well, but I think a blog allows you to do that. To my immediate right is Julia Guman, who is a literary agent, who's been an agent for how many years now?
Well, since 2004.
2004, many years. Yeah. So you know what you're doing now.
Well, at long last, yeah.
Finally, you've figured it out. Julia's been an agent for a number of Russian language writers, including, her client list includes Ludmila Petrushevskaya, Marina Stepanova, and many others, and we might talk about some individual writers. And at the very far end of the stage, all the way over there, is Ksenia Popazova, who is the managing editor of Glagoslav Publications, which we will talk a little bit about, which is an independent English-Dutch publishing house, and she's also currently a PhD candidate at the University of Manchester. And I think we should talk about that too. I want to talk about everything. We have to do it really quickly because I have a long list of things to talk about. We're going to start by asking Güzel to say a little bit about her particular experience. So she's going to talk to us for a few minutes about her experience as a writer and as the writer of this novel, and then we'll open to a wider conversation. Please.
Hello. Oops. So my name is Güzel Yachin, and I'm the author of 2 novels. The first one, Zuleika, has just come out in English in One World Publishing House in a wonderful translation of Lisa Hayden. The novel describes the fate of a young Tatar peasant woman who was subjected to repression in 1930. Her husband was killed, and Zuleika herself was sent to Siberia when she spent 16 years in exile. Thus, the subject of the description is the repressions against the Soviet peasantry in the early Stalin years. Rising above the subject of the description, we can say it's a novel about a woman who goes through an amazing metamorphosis, from a domestic slave who every morning makes a chamber part of her mother-in-law, to a strong and independent woman who chooses a man herself, makes decisions about her life, goes to the taiga with a gun and beats the game, getting food for the whole village. About a woman who lives her second life, completely different from the first one. By the way, the original title of the book is Zuleika Opens Her Eyes. The same phrase is the first one in the novel. The same phrase is repeated 4 times per the whole text, setting the rhythm. Every time Zuleika opens her eyes, she sees new surroundings. At first, it's darkness, closeness, and stuffness of a country house, and at the end, the blinding sun which hurts the eyes. Of course, this title is symbolic. It contains the whole way of the heroine, from the night pot in the hand in the first chapters to the gun in the hand in the last chapters. This metamorphosis is typical for early Soviet time. At that time, the process of women's emancipation was very active in the country, especially among women from the eastern regions, and Zuleika refers to them. It all began in 1917, when Russian women received the right to vote on an equal basis with men, one of the first in the world. The very first were women in New Zealand and Australia, then in Sweden, and very soon women in Russia. This process took a long time all over the world. In the US, women got voting right in 1920, in the UK in 1928, in France in 1944, in Germany in 1948, and in Kuwait in 2005. So, Russian women were equalized in rights with men very early. Then came the Soviet period of history. One of the foundations of Soviet ideology was the idea of full equality of people, including gender equality, of course. This idea was promoted very hard. In early Soviet years, many films and paintings were made, novels were written about strong young women. And if you look at the decorative and monumental art of the early Soviet years, always on reliefs, mosaics in the subway, facades of houses, monuments, everywhere, you will see 2 persons, a man and a woman, as strong and muscular as a man. Later, a powerful ideology was supported by the historical process. 3 wars, the World War I, the World War II, the Civil War in Russia, then Stalin's repressions, it all took millions of men's lives, and it was a terrible price for the emancipation of Soviet women. Tragedies followed one after another, and women got used to replace the men, to become heads of families, to raise children without men. In later Soviet times, in the 80s and 90s of the last century, no one was surprised meeting a female director of the factory, for example, or a female deputy of the country council. Women worked in everything from construction sites to the streets where they laid asphalt. Rather, in our country, there was another problem: weak and pampered men, indecisive, not able to struggle for a life. We still feel the legacy of the Soviet past. According to Thornton International Study of 2015, Russia is the world leader in the number of women in managerial positions. By the way, the second place takes Poland, also a country with a Soviet past. I was born in 1977 and still had a Soviet childhood. From 2001 to 2010, I worked in the field of marketing in different positions. In 2014, I came to the world of literature. Not once in my life have I felt discriminated on the basis of gender, neither in my childhood, nor when I worked in the business world, nor when I came to the world of literature. Yes, it is very difficult for a young and unknown author to publish the first novel, but this has nothing to do with gender. The main criterion is the quality of the text. I believe that the problem of women's equality is not the most urgent one in Russia. Yes, there is an expression, women's literature. One expression denotes 2 different phenomena. On one hand, sentimental and low-quality fiction for women. On the other hand, the literature written by women. My novel is often referred as women's literature, and I take it very calm. If you look at the modern literary process in Russia, you will see a large number of female names among translators, editors, publishers, critics, and award-winning writers. You may know Людмила Улицкая, Людмила Петрушевская, Елена Чижова, Marina Stepnova. Their books were translated into many languages. You probably know Svetlana Alexievich, also a woman with a Soviet past. So to sum up, I believe that this gender problem is not the most relevant, the most urgent one in Russia in general and in the Russian literary world and book market in particular. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's so much I wanted to ask about there. It's always worrying when you do one of these panels when you think everyone's going to agree with each other. And I listen to that and think maybe some people are going to disagree with each other. It's suddenly become a more interesting conversation already. Thank you. I'm going to come back to a few particular things you mentioned in a moment. Julia, can I ask you about this question of women's literature and women's fiction as a sort of category of thing, which Gisela mentioned? There is this idea we have in the UK, almost a category of this thing which Gisela described as sort of sentimental, and this incredibly reductive, limiting idea of what it should be. Do you see that as a problem in the Russian market itself as well?
Well, actually, when I was thinking about the topic, I was judging, trying to estimate this from this perspective. If gender and like women's sentimental literature is an issue for the modern Russian process, which I think is not the case. Well, as an agency, we handle roughly 40 writers. Among them, more than half of them are women. Most of them work in the genre. And that's another issue which I wanted to bring up later, as if the conversation goes to that realm. But one of them is Lyudmila Petrushevskaya, for instance, who was mentioned not more than once already, who is a Russian living classic, who positions herself as a poet for women, as a female voice, female literary voice, who speaks for women, for the deprived women. The prototypical character of Petrushevskaya is a woman suffering in her family life, more or less. But the paradox here that in translation she got known not through the role that she so openly took up herself, but through her quirky, scary, urban fairy tales that came into the New York Times bestseller list and won her World Fantasy Award, etc.
And that's sorry to interrupt, but that's also it's partly a publishing decision, isn't it? It's a positioning. This was Penguin, wasn't it?
Yeah,
and they chose a kind of very quirky title for the book. For the books. And it's about that as well.
That's true, but it also they followed up with 3 titles after that, and none worked as well. And all those 3 titles dealt with this female, with the woman as an issue, a woman in the family, a woman as a mother, but none worked as relatively good sales-wise. So probably it's just also that the readers are more inclined to read about, or at least when it comes to translation from Russian language, are more inclined to read about some scary fairy tales, modern tales, rather than about sufferings of a woman in the family.
I wonder how much we're talking about cultural difference, but we're also talking about cultural expectations. And I wonder whether, Lisa, you have a sense of whether there is then an expectation either among publishers or among readers that a Russian book or a book by a Russian woman writer is supposed to be about this or is expected to be about that. And therefore, if you're a writer, you as a translator who's kind of brokering these things in a sense, you have a sense that publishers would like writers to fit into a sort of category, fit into a recognizable box.
I guess I haven't really run across that. And that might be partly, it's an interesting question. No, I don't think they're looking for boxes.
Well,
I think they're looking for good texts.
Well, but though, very often, and it really happens when we deal with international publishers. Very often, international publishers would approach us saying, give us a woman's story. And preferably, it should be written by a woman, and it should be a woman's story, a woman's drama. So
and
that's
not happy, ideally.
Ideally, it shouldn't be a happy one. So. There are some cliches that are expected, like publishers' cliches, I would say, that we try to fit into. And we are like, now we start browsing through the catalogue thinking, whether that would fit, really. how sufferings are severe enough, whether sufferings are severe enough, as described in the novel. So that's an issue, I think.
And is that... I want to try and, because of our subject, I want to try and pin down which of the bits of that are to do with gender and which are to do with other kinds of cultural imperialism or prejudice, whatever. And I wonder whether you feel there is a difference if you go with a novel by Wodalaskin as opposed to something by Petruszewska, whether the expectations are different or the burden is different if you are saying, here is a writer from Russia, a woman or a man. Or is that not, as Giselle was saying, is that not the issue?
You know, I see, to come back to your question to me about what do I see, maybe it's helpful to sort of think about the chain of how this all works. I think publishers tend to come to somebody like Yulia and see her as sort of a supermarket. You know, like, we're looking for a book written by a woman, because she has a broad choice of authors. You've got, a couple dozen authors who are pretty varied, and they're all kind of somewhere on the mainstream literary continuum. But when they come to me to ask for suggestions, they already know, I'm like a boutique, you know, or like the little brand in Target or something, where they know what my preferences are, because I have this whole trail, like my paper trail, which is Ether, on my blog. So they know that I like structure, they know that I like a book with a plot, preferably, or some sort of an arc. They know that I'm looking for something that has what I call a solid internal logic of the text. They're coming to me to ask about something that fits already a more limited strictures.
And so it's already narrowing down, it's already ruling out certain kind of things for other categories.
Yeah, although I do like a good detective novel.
Right.
You know, but to me, my suggestions are very, they're very targeted. I also really look to matching. I don't recommend the same thing to everybody. I like to look at every publisher's lists. I like to read their books. You know, I like to get a good feel for what they're doing.
Right. Ksenia, I'll ask you about Blagoslav in a moment, but just as someone who has lived in different places and has been part of the book culture or the studying of books culture in a number of different countries, how much variety do you see? How much do you, being in the Netherlands, being in the UK, and Manchester now, how much do you see the conversation about the role of gender in the writing of books changes as a sort of by cultural determinant?
Well, I think that in the UK, usually people are quite obsessed with their identity, and that's, as a result, with their gender. Yeah. The problem is not so urgent in the Netherlands, as far as I can see that. And I mean, I was born in the Soviet Union, and I believe that I will share mostly, the same experience with the same experience as our speakers, because as a publisher, we do not look into, a women's story. And I will never write to any literary agent and ask, I want a female story, and preferably a sad one, or very sad one. So for us, it's much more important if this is a good story, if we like that, and regardless any gender. We are not interested, being in the UK and I see that there are some translation prizes which are, focused on like women's, and I agree that probably they should be supported. But I came from a very different culture. Well, I was born probably just before the fall of the Soviet Union, but still I would like when I read as a reader too, I do not care about who is the author and their gender.
And the book you mentioned this just before we started. The first book I think that was published by Glagoslav was written by a woman, but that wasn't an issue. You sort of don't even notice that. It wasn't. No one makes a fuss about this.
So I joined actually Glagoslav a bit later. And Yelena's Chizhova book was the first one they published, and they did some calculations. So if we so far we have published a bit more than 100 titles, and a bit more than 30% of them are female authors. So I think it's not a bad percentage, but well, again, we didn't care, about that. So if we saw that we like the author, I mean, this is the second book we published this year by Yelena Chizhova, so why not?
You mentioned the prize for translating women in this country, the Warwick Prize for Women in Translation. One of the reasons it exists was to highlight and hope to remedy a very specific problem, which is actually just in terms of the numbers. We publish about twice as many books translated by male writers as by female writers. It's almost exactly 2 to 1, for reasons that we can speculate about, I suppose. Lisa, this puts the translator in a very particular position, that whether you want to or not, you have the possibility of being, I don't want to say activist if that's not what you want to be, but you're in the position to be someone who can actually change something, because we sort of know what the symptoms are now.
Right, yeah, and that's a really good point. I'm glad you raised this, because my friend and colleague Catherine Young, who translates poetry and prose, and she's a poet as well, she's preparing as a talk for a conference where she'll be speaking about this topic, and she asked about crunching numbers from lists of translations that I post on my blog each year, saying what publishers have published what books and who's translated them. And so we went through the numbers and found that, I won't take out the numbers, but they fit pretty well with the numbers that you mentioned, the sort of 2 to 1. In the Daily today, somebody handed this to me right before before we got started. Chad Post from Open Letters said last year just over 59% of translated books were written by men and about 36% by women. And that's a slight increase for women, over 66% for men in 2017 and 30% for women. And the numbers for Russian were about the same, and I don't make any proclamations that my lists are complete, because this is just something that I do in my spare time. But when Kate started looking at who was translating the books, basically the conclusion she came to was, if women don't translate women, nobody's going to translate women. So we need to pay attention to what we're doing if we want to make sure that women's voices are being heard in translation. And the numbers that she found fit with what some other women had found for other languages. So it's not just us with Russian. And I'll probably leave it at that for now.
And there are, in fact, more, in the English-speaking world, there are more women translating than men at the moment.
May I ask you a question, Lisa?
Yeah.
Does it feel different for you as a translator to work with male fiction versus female fiction? Not in the derogatory sense of sensitive
sexual stuff. Well, sometimes, I do have to admit that sometimes there are weird moments where I wonder, okay, what would a man really say about this? But I would.
Do you have men you ask about this? Do you have like a focus group saying?
Chat groups. I go online for chat groups. No.
That's very dangerous. That's a high risk strategy.
I use Look Inside or something.
Right.
No. The answer is yes and no. No, in the sense that what I look for, again, this comes back to the internal logic of the text, and I want a text that I really relate to. I'm looking for something where I hear the voices. I want to be able to do my best to channel whatever is in a book. There are certain male authors like Von Alaskin who I just read them and I kind of hear the voices immediately and I know what my end goal is. And then there might be examples, and I won't mention any names, but there might be examples of books written by women that I just don't relate to. And this is perfectly normal. This is just how we are. So that's no. I don't feel a difference. But yet, on the other hand, of course, there are certain issues that I relate to more, and certain feelings and certain words and expressions, and I know what a woman would say. So, or what I might say, or what friends might say. And so there is something that is a little bit easier, but on the whole, I would probably still come down with, well, I guess I'd come down with yes and no. I'm a translator, that's what we do.
Yes, depends on the context.
Depends on the context.
Well, that is the answer to, it depends is the answer to every interesting question, isn't it?
Yeah,
really?
yeah.
Guzel, I want to come back to something you said when you started at the beginning, because when you were describing, you were sort of half categorizing your novel. It's a novel about a woman who, but not wanting to put it in a particular box. But I'm interested in the question of who reads your book and who is reading these books. And one of the reasons it's a really interesting question in this country, as in many countries, the overwhelming proportion, the overwhelming majority of readers of fiction are women. And in fact, and in Russia too, I think. And actually, writers of fiction, we haven't historically had a really big problem of novels in English being written more by men than by women. It hasn't actually been a problem. There's been a problem of visibility and reception and so forth. But I want to ask about that readership and whether you know who is reading your book, whether you care who is reading your book, because your relationship is with 170,000 individual people who are reading this story.
I have written 2 novels. The first one is about a woman mainly, and the second one, title is Volga Children. It's about a man. It's about a relationship between a man and his daughter, and about father's love, to say so. Of course, more women read my books. I see it on the meetings, on the launches of the book. I see it on the emails which I get. I see it on the letters. I see it also on the communication on Facebook, for example. But there is also a part of men, a share of men who read, and I get also some notices from them. Especially about my second book, which is devoted to father and daughter. And that corresponds maybe better with men.
And one thing, since we're talking about readership, I even have a note card about this, about stereotypes, because sometimes people will say, oh, it's more women that read these books. Well, there's one that I want to blow up that stereotype, at least for the situation of the Yasna Polyana Award, which Zuleyka won. The jury for that award is, how many jurors? 5 or 6. They're all men. And the youngest one is Vodolazkin, who's a little bit younger than I am. So this is, 5, 6 men that chose the book. And they also co-awarded the next year, I think it was, 2 books. One was a short, like a novella written by a man, and the other was a novel written by a woman, Narine Avgaryan, whom I've also translated. And now this is a book that starts off with, let's just say, gynecological issues. And I don't want to spoil anything for anybody with what happens in the beginning. But I mean, this is something that starts off with serious women's health stuff. And it's a bunch of guys that chose it. So, I mean, anybody that's saying that men don't read these books in Russia isn't quite right, because here's a jury that really appreciated these books.
But I think one of the issues is a prize jury is slightly different.
They are.
Because one of the things, not only because they will be professional readers and experienced and whatever, but also because I think a lot of the time when we say this isn't a book that men will read, it's not that they wouldn't like it if they read it. It's to do with, will they pick it up? It's to do with, there's something on the cover which says to them, this is not for you, this is for these people instead. And it's about positioning it for the readers. It's not saying, you can try it, but you're going to hate it. It's about saying, this is not for you at all. Sorry, were you going to?
No, not at the moment, no.
You looked like you were poised to interrupt me and say, idiot, what are you talking about? No, that wasn't what you were going to say.
No, I wouldn't claim that
we treat men with respect.
As is right and proper, as I demand in all of my panels. I'm on very dangerous ground here, aren't I? How do you feel about that, Ksenia? How do you feel about this idea of I suppose how we, and this may be to do with, it's maybe a cultural thing or a marketing as well, but to do with how we position books for a readership or for a market, whether we might want gender to be an issue, we might not want it to be, but it might be anyway. How do you feel?
I suppose it should depend on the genre of the book, to be honest, because definitely in Russia there are books which are written by women and they're meant for women because for like some kind of romances which are usually at least I consider them very low quality literature. And they're just for entertainment, but I believe that books in Russia they have quite a special status, and we try to perceive our literature as serious one, and that's why we treasure both like female authors, male authors, something like that.
Well, you mentioned genre writers in the list.
It's just like we have quite a few female writers who work in this genre, especially in the genre that in Russia is perceived as specifically male one, like thrillers and sci-fi. And historically it's quite interesting because in the 90s, one of our Maria Galina, one of our established writers working in the genre on the cross-border between genres, she had to adopt a male pseudonym, pen name, just to be published, because she was not published as a woman working in the sci-fi. But it was back in the 1990s. What's going on now? Is quite so. I think that the angle has changed so drastically. So, and it also has to do with packaging. Like take Valentina Nazarova. She wrote her debut book a couple of years ago, and that's the second title. That's Thrillers. And so we had to fight with the publisher for the cover, to change the cover, because originally in the cover they put a high-heeled female figure, and the title is When You Are Gone. And so it's a thriller based set in Barcelona, and that's a noir, urban noir, dark thriller, doing with cyber technologies and cyber insecurity issues. So it has nothing to do with romance, it has nothing to do with a love drama and all those conflicts. And then you have a high-heeled female figure standing near the sea and looking in the into the fog. And so we are saying, what are you doing? Why are you packaging it like that? And they say, more than 65% of readers of thrillers nowadays are women. So we want a cover that would fit into the expectations of a female reader. And then I had to step in, and I said, no, we have to at least we change it to the male figure in the background. So that's a very different now. It turned clockwise somehow. Now we have to fight for a female writer to be working in the thriller genre, not to be put in or packaged as a romantic women's writer, but as a thriller writer, for God's sake.
I mean, Lisa, presumably you see this in the US. I know you're not an expert in American writers, but you are presumably someone who goes into American bookstores not infrequently. I don't know you well, but I would guess, because you're in this line of work. Do you have that sense of going into the market to which all readers are exposed and seeing categories and shorthands and slightly dumb stereotypes where you walk in and go, they're trying to make this book look like this is obviously trying to sell to men, this is obviously trying to sell to women?
Yes. Well, actually, when I think about it, I went on a big book binge in preparation for this. I'll make the long story short, but a salvage store near me had a huge sale on books from flooded bookstores. And so it was a great excuse for me to go and buy huge piles of books written by women. And so I started, working through this pile. And you know what book came up in my mind when you asked this question was Tangerine. And I don't remember who the author is of the book, a woman, but the book is set in Tangier. And it's got a beautiful photo, and I don't remember the name of the photographer, of a woman. I think the British cover is almost exactly the same. But it's a woman, looking like she's in a really hot climate and kind of looking like this into the sun. But it's from the 50s, and it's a very stylistic, stylized, stylish photo. And that, to me, really spoke of, it's almost like she's looking in the distance at her readership, And it's just, it's glamorous. And the book it's about women. It's a good book. But that one is probably the one that comes to mind the most. There are a lot of flowery covers, too. I think that was especially stylish in both places. 2 or 3 years ago, the flowery thing kind of came in. I'm glad to see that drifting away. Abating, yeah. Trying to think of what else. I meant to take a photo of the bookshelf with these books because, Atessa, what is it called? My Year of...
Mosfeg, yes.
Yes, thank you. And the book was called, I'm terrible with titles and author names. My Year of Rest and Relaxation. Thank you. Russian colleague here helping out. But that's got a painting with a low-cut dress, and maybe that appeals to men, too. I hope it does, because it's a good book. But it's...
Is she also looking out into the distance somewhere?
Yes, kind of, yeah.
Look, maybe there's a man somewhere in the distance.
Yeah,
that's the most persistent trend, I think.
Yeah, but it's a woman on the cover again, and I wonder who they're trying to appeal to with that one. And Zuleika. This does fit a scene in the book, though.
Right. I want to open in just a moment to questions from you, or comments, contributions from you. But going back to something that Güzel said at the very beginning about actually not thinking gender is the problem, the big problem now, or the big problem for her, or the big problem in Russia. And you said, I think, in these words, I have never been discriminated against because of my gender. I wonder if each of you could just say, if that is not the problem, what is the problem? Because we have certain symptoms which are to do with the way publishers market things. We have certain symptoms to do with the numbers of books that get translated. But I'd be interested to know if you can identify the problem which, in a sense, we would like to solve. We know that the Warwick Prize for Women in Translation is there because the setting up of that prize was an activist decision to try and fix a problem. And I wonder, this is a very difficult question, but I'm going to start with Ksenia anyway, because she just caught my eye, which was very foolish. Do you have can you put your finger on what the problem is, other than there are very long embedded prejudices and patriarchal stereotypes and all the things that we sort of know we're dealing with?
Overall, I cannot see any problem with trying, with their efforts to bring more female authors. And we can definitely see that there is a problem that translations is not, for instance, they are not so often, they are not translated so often and brought to the UK as it is in Russia, for instance. I think I grew up reading all these translations of classics, and I think in these days I actually would like to see some statistics about translations, because I think their Russian market is very saturated with translations, not only local authors. So there is nothing wrong, and I believe that bringing to the light that there are female authors, they are good, and they can be read by both genders. I think it's a good initiative, to be honest.
Thank you. Güzel.
Was the question about the problem on the market in the whole?
Well, yes, about if you think there is a problem. You said that you didn't experience that sort of discrimination yourself, or whether you think there is still some problem. Maybe we can start from something Ksenia just said about what is being published and what isn't. Because I mentioned that at the moment we translate far fewer books by women than by men here. And I wonder if you feel the same in Russia, whether the books to which you are exposed, the things that are being imported from America or from the rest of Europe, whether you feel there is a sort of distortion of some kind in the books that are coming to Russian readers.
I don't know the figure about the share of translated fiction and nonfiction in Russia. I know the figures about World English, for example. I know that the share of translated books in World English is about 2% on the market, and of translated fiction is only 1%. So it's a very small share, extremely small share. English-speaking people really read very few translated books. But in Russia, figures are bigger, figures are higher anyway. I don't know about, maybe Julia knows.
Not
20%, 30%,
so it's over. It's
like share.
Yeah, Russian market is more translated fiction oriented than native production. So it's like Russian language writers. Yeah, we're inclined to import more than just nourish local writers, native language writers. But Güzel is a very lucky case here. I mean, like she, with her debut book, she became a huge national bestseller, a huge one. Like she's a long-selling, best-selling, nationally recognized writer who won multiple awards. So she's the example of how there are no stereotypes in quality literary fiction these days in Russia, whether you're a woman or a man. So gender plays no role at all. And the only thing that matters, and we started with that, is whether it's a good novel or not. Hers was a good one, and it became a huge bestseller and a success both with readers, critics, literary experts like us.
And her publisher's thrilled.
Of course. Lisa, can I just ask you just a very particular thing, which is actually to do with the blog as well as what we were talking about a moment ago? Because I'd like to end just with a question about what the translator can do. Not just translating, not just choosing to translate this person rather than that person, but also being part of that conversation about interesting writers you find, and in your case with the blog. And I wonder whether it's to do with gender or not. One of the things you can do is about expanding what is available, expanding what is being talked about, saying it's not just these three people you've heard of, it's also that one. So kind of pushing at a sort of pluralism of gender as well as other things.
I'm glad you asked that, because that was kind of how I wanted to react to your question that you'd asked for everyone. What can we do? I mean, the way I see it is, for one thing, the agents are doing a pretty good job with lists that contain a lot of books by men and women. I'm not sure what the statistics would be, but it seems as if the main agencies that are working with Russian writers do work with a lot of women. But I think for translators, I think sometimes translators maybe don't realize that they are, in effect, scouts. I mean, they're literary scouts. And we all need to be really aware of what is happening, not just on the bestseller lists or when we go into a bookstore, but who's on award lists, which sometimes are very short on books written by women, which really bothers me, because there is so much good fiction being written by women right now, highly varied, and I've got a card about that too, but I won't go into that. But we should all, we all need to do due diligence. And so what really hurts me is when I hear complaints about the statistics, but translators aren't doing that due diligence and really looking into what's happening and going online and looking at online bookstores and the online journals and things like that, and just really exploring the options, because there's really a lot of good stuff out there.
And I think at least it's probably fair to say that at least in the English-speaking world, in terms of what's being translated, there is a slow shift, but there is a shift in those numbers.
Yes.
Which I'm not going to go into in detail. It was very pleasing, in fact, to see the Man Booker International long list yesterday, 13 novels and works of fiction in translation. I think 7 were written by women, which is higher than it's been ever by some margin, actually. We have about 15 minutes. And that was very quick. An extra prize for being, before I'd even finish my question. In the second row there, please. No, quickly, while you remember. Tap the microphone, please.
I just have a feeling that by squeezing, which is how I see it as a writer, the books into genres, and I experienced this myself. It was marketed as a thriller, and it's not actually a thriller. It was described by someone as a literary espionage novel or something. I think it perpetuates this women readers, men readers, women readers, men readers. And I noticed that male friends saying, "Oh, I love the book," and not so much women, because they bought it more. So what I'm saying is that I think there's a level of deception in the publishing industry, I'm sorry, but in forcing writers almost to say what genre is it, because many books fall between genres, and it's very difficult for a writer to write real books when you're being pushed and forced into the marketing thing.
So may I just ask you, so you're talking in fact not just about you produce your book and you're not just talking about how the publisher sells it or packages it or whatever, you're talking about at the earlier stage
the
also
writer.
There is a pressure on you to write a certain
even
kind
the
of
title,
book.
even my title, I was going to call it something that is really what the book is about, and they said, "Oh no, call it the Budapest Job." Fabulous. So fine.
Thank you. We recognise this phenomenon, I suspect, but not among the writers, possibly. Interesting. Any other comments, questions? Right at the back, and then we'll come to the front here.
Hello. This isn't necessarily about translation, but I've only just entered the publishing industry, and I've noticed that a lot of literary novels by young women, beautiful women, are required. And I was wondering if you almost had noticed a gender bias in the opposite way, that it helps to be a young, beautiful woman when trying to publish into the literary sphere as opposed to an older guy. So it's slightly controversial. I'm not saying I feel one way or the other, but I was wondering if that's something you noticed as well.
As an agent selling, do you have photos of your authors in your catalogue?
Well, actually, most of my female clients are just stars. They're so charming, beautiful, so good, just beautiful ambassadors of their own work. And Guzelle here. So, though she's not a client of mine, but a client of my good friends and companions. And yes, I think it helps. It helps on the stage when the book is out, and when our writers visit festivals, they travel abroad, and they start speaking for their novels. And yes, when you're a beautiful, charming woman, of course, it wins over the audience. It helps.
There's also something Guzelle said earlier about some places, and here being one where identity is such an issue, where the writer, as well as the writing, the writer themselves as a person, as a presence, as an identity, is also part of the conversation. And as you said, travelling and being on festivals and kind of having to represent the work. I mean, embodied, do they have to be there as a person to represent the work? It's not just enough to have 80,000 great words in sequence.
Exactly. Yeah.
Can I just add? Ludmila Ulitska, I think she is in her 70s, and Yelena Chizrova, if I'm not mistaken, 61.
Petrushevskaya turned 80 last year.
Oh, even yeah. So I'm not. They're still young and beautiful. Let's agree on that.
Yes.
Yeah,
but she's just beauty. Stunning. She wears all those hats, and she's just stunning. She's a cabaret singer. So yes, she's the star.
So yes is the answer to that question, I think. There was a question here in the front row, and then we'll go. We'll take with that one there, and then we will get to you.
Thanks. Just following up on something Lisa said a bit. Those comments you said about if women don't translate women, then nobody will translate women. That's really damning.
Not quite nobody, but
okay. Well, yeah.
But I mean.
But illustrates the point. Yeah.
It's not the statistics. There are some men who are translating women. I mean, I didn't mean that literally, but when she and I were emailing about it, it was basically kind of a bottom line. If women are going to get translated consistently, women really need to to show up and put forth ideas for translating women. There are some men that Kate found have been translating a lot of women writers. Arch Tate, for example, has translated a lot of, relatively a lot of books that were written by women. I didn't mean that literally,
no, but
I just in general as sort of a trend. Yeah.
But the question was, there's a book that I'd really like to be the translator of, which is by a woman. It's a literary biography by a woman about a woman, because I'm interested in the subject and I'm interested in the field. It's a book about a woman mountaineer. But I've asked myself the question, actually, would this be better translated by a woman? Is that a question I should be asking myself in the first place at all? And if it is, what elements should I be considering before I give my answer?
Thank you.
I don't know. It's almost an existential question, I would say. What I would do if I were you, if I were a man, which I can't imagine quite being, but I would probably try translating a sample. Have you done that? Try it and see if you hear the voice.
I completely agree with Lisa, because sometimes when I offer our translators a book, they have a look at it and then they can say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to take it. It's not my stuff. And then the conversation is over. So, yes, I think you need to see if you like it, if you really like that.
If you read it and heard it, that's already a good sign, but maybe you really won't find the voice.
But we're also starting from a sort of good place in that conversation, because what Lisa was saying was, when you said something about women have to kind of show up and put forward ideas, it's not just about responding to what's being offered to you, because I think that's a very easy, when the statistics for how many women we were translating in this country were published, and I thought that's absolutely disgraceful, and then I looked at what I translated and it's dramatically biased towards men, but I just accept or reject things as they come.
Exactly.
And there's that kind of proactivity then that's needed from the translator, rather than just trying to say yes to the right things.
Right, and the word activist was used somewhere along the way. I don't see myself as a natural activist, but on the other hand, I do think about these things, and it's kind of like, it's only fair. At some level, there's a lot of different levels we can look at this on: ethical, moral, getting voices out, but it's just plain not fair, because there's so much good fiction being written by women. I'm going to say it again. It's not right if it's not heard.
Thank you. I have a question here in the front.
I think it's more
an
observation about some of our deep-seated conditioned behaviour. And if we all agree that the contents of the book are wonderful, then what is sometimes very off-putting is the covers on the front, and they're dividing the people more than what's actually being written. But if I look at the books here, and we particularly look at the Russian ones, there are 5 here, and I couldn't tell whether they were written by men or women. And I want to say how much I appreciate that. As I walk into a bookshop, I don't know whether it's by a man or a woman. It's only the English one here that I would say would be written by a woman.
Thank you very much. We have time for. We'll take several questions quickly. Then one at the back here, and then the front row, and then we'll take Anna there, and then we're going to have to stop, I think.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was just wondering about women in translation with more a diverse background, because a lot of women that are translated are still white and middle class. What is being done for women of color, women of different social backgrounds, and LGBTQ+, and just in general that? Thank you.
Lisa, is that a conversation that's happening finally in the US, as it's beginning to happen here, the diversity among the professions?
Yes.
It's the sort of thing that... Do you feel like it's got beyond a panel at Alta every year, like we have a panel every year saying it's really important that we diversify the profession, and so we'll talk about it again next year? Does it feel like it's... it's hard to measure unless you know numbers, but does it feel like it's changing?
Yeah, I do, and that's actually something that Kate mentioned as well when we were corresponding about this over email, that she feels that this conversation has ramifications for a lot of other types of books. That's probably the wrong way to put it, but for a lot of other forms of diversity in what's being published. I didn't look at statistics on that, but yeah, in general, I do have a feeling that the offerings have broadened a lot.
Good. Well, that's promising.
Can
here,
I add something? As a publisher, sometimes some translators, get in contact with us and ask, they send us their CVs and ask about possibilities. So overall, I think all our translators are white European women and men, definitely, right? So, and I'm not sure that Russian studies at universities is a very popular, subject or major with, people of other, backgrounds. So probably we should look into that at first and then think about other consequences.
That's a good point.
Question here in front.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for bringing my attention to Russian female writers. My admission is I've only read Tolstoy. So apologies for that. I plan to rectify it with Zuleika when it comes out. My question as a translator is for Lisa. Your name doesn't appear on the cover. The male Spanish author of Svetlana Alexievich, book does. How important is it for you, or does it matter that your name doesn't appear? Presuming it appears on the back cover.
It's not on the back cover either. I think we would all like to have our names on the covers. I'm on the title page. But one thing, the title page. We would all like to have our names on the front covers. And I that's another thing that I think is only fair. Because we are, as Vodolazkin said, we're co-authors. And, that's how we see ourselves. But acknowledgements, one of the things that I do usually ask for is a chance to acknowledge the people that I've helped, or to maybe explain not too directly, but, to give hints about how to read the book if there's something unusual about it. And so that, I see that as sort of a form of compensation for not having the visibility on the front cover. But I'd rather be there.
Last question from Anna.
Hi, thank you to all the panel. I was very interested in what Güzel was saying about equality in Russia, because my experience as an English person who married to a Russian and who studied Russian and now translates from Russian is that Russia is a culture that's rather chauvinist, actually. And before I went first to Russia, for my year abroad, I was warned that it was very 19th century in its attitudes to the sexes. But at the same time, it is, as usual, that Russian paradox, that they're opposites equally at work. It's undeniable that there also is great equality in Russia in many ways. That applies also for ethnicity. I think there was this Soviet myth that all the races in Russia were equal, which was certainly not both true and very untrue. My own translations from Russia of Russian authors is biased towards men, and I've translated books on war, on torture, on army conscription, on prison camps. These are spheres of life. I think that it's important to remember that men and women both can have subtle differences. We're biologically different, obviously, and we're mentally and emotionally different in subtle ways, as well as being, again, a paradox, as well as being the same, having huge overlap. But there are certain spheres of life where men will dominate, and so that will naturally be reflected in literary fiction. That's what I'd suggest.
Thank you very much. I'm actually going to direct that question to Yulia just briefly, because when Güzel was saying at the beginning that Russia is the country with the highest proportion of senior management being women, you looked surprised by that.
Yeah. I'm still surprised. I will have to double-check that. Because, to my experience, it is male-dominated country. So, yeah. On the other hand, all creative sphere, and publishing in particular, and teaching and publishing and arts, it has always been the realm that it was supposed to be a female women's world. So yes, when we think about administrative power authorities in these spheres, well, we expect there would be a lady on top, but in all other publishing and education and all those stuff, but not in other realms. So I was really surprised when Guzelle mentioned that. So maybe that's something that I have overlooked in my real life.
Thank you. I'm sorry to say it's just gone 12:30. We are going to have to stop. We have not, as you gather, we have not exhausted this topic. It's not a not insubstantial topic. We're going to have to stop here. I hope we will keep talking about this, not only this time next year. There is a lot to be said and I suspect to be done as well. Before we stop, do please join me in thanking our panel, Ksenia, Guzelle, Lisa and Julia.